there weren't that many women of color, particularly as we got into leadership. It's what they can call sort of death by 1,000 paper cuts. I think for me personally, it was more that almost an internal gaslighting that happens, because day by day, goalposts will move as you become more senior, and you may not have objective criteria for promotion. It's just a feel or a culture or a fit that you might not have.
I visited Dubai, and then anytime I meet someone and they find out that I'm Filipino, they say, "Oh, Filipino, you're very hardworking. You're a very hardworking group."
Welcome to Level Up, Don't Burn Out, the podcast where we explore the balance between career success and well-being. I'm Life Coach Ken, and I coach managers level up without burning out.
Hi, this is Life Coach Ken, and this is Level Up, Don't Burn Out. Welcome to another episode of Level Up, Don't Burn Out. And today, we're diving into a topic that's incredibly relevant in leadership. How can you be a champion for DEI while making sure that you are being authentic and not just crossing something off your checklist? And of course, in this podcast, we always talk about well-being. So how do you not get burned out in the process? So I'm thrilled to have attorney Dharshi Harindra with me today. Dharshi is a technology lawyer. She's a leadership coach. She's ICF ACC certified, and she's a DEI practitioner. And she's also the host of the podcast UNBiased. And in that podcast, she tackles big issues like inclusion, representation, and navigating bias in the workplace. So Dharshi brings a wealth of experience in helping lawyers find their voice. But today we're going to explore how leaders, not just in law, but leaders in general, find their voice and remain true to their identity while being a champion for DEI, foster diversity, and avoid burnout in the process. So Dharshi, welcome to the show. I can't wait to dive into this conversation with you.
Thank you, Ken. It's such an honor to be joining you and discussing topics that are so close to both our hearts.
Wow. Okay, Dharshi, let me just start off with your background, because you have such a unique background. You have such a unique journey. You're combining law. You're a lawyer. You could have just pursued that, but you're also an ICF certified coach or a leadership coach, and you're a champion for DEI. So I'm really curious what inspired you to take that path, and how has it shaped how you approach leadership today?
Yes, sure. I mean, I'm getting older, Ken. So I have been around for a while in many guises, and I suppose it's an iterative journey that has taken me to where I am today. And there's probably a few cliches that get involved. As a few years ago, and I was approaching 40. I was a mother. I had been practicing corporate law in big law firms around the world for big companies in-house, and I'd always been an advocate for diversity and inclusion throughout my career. That's come from a combination of both being underrepresented often, or being often the only. I started my career in the UK and then moved to Australia. There weren't that many women of color, particularly as we got into leadership. So it was partly to drive that from my own perspective, but also I'm someone that in a career in an industry like law, which is quite elite because of all of the barriers to entry. It means you'll necessarily have to have a university education. If you want to get into some of those bigger firms, you have to have achieved in some of those big name institutions. And I am very cognizant of the level of privilege that I've had through my life, being, born into a very stable household with means and education and access. And I thought, if there are spaces where I'm feeling underrepresented and I'm feeling that some things can be unfair, then that must mean that there are a whole load more people from all different walks of life that feel the same way. So that sort of always drove my kind of quest for fairness. And where I am today is that culmination. Maybe if you think about when we're looking, whether you call it purpose or dharma or ikigai, and you're told to find, the thing that you're good at, and then the things that you love to do, and then the things that there are a demand for. And that probably brought inclusion and leadership and coaching into the legal industry, because it's what I know, it's what I do well, and it's actually something I enjoy doing. But as you touched on a bit in the intro, those principles of inclusion and leadership span much further. And so that's really kind of what has brought me to where I am. And I think as a formula for finding that, just thinking about the things that you have technical expertise in and a real credibility in, plus that real passion. And for me, it was really understanding or having a willingness to listen and learn and understand how people work, how people can be their best selves. And the coaching part was really about understanding that everyone has those answers within themselves, and that we can support people from backgrounds that don't see themselves in positions of power or leadership or influence to get there. So I suppose the driving force is that real desire to see more representation in leadership and those positions of influence. I've been brought up in the corporate world, and a lot of my work is really very much rooted there. And I just have this deep-seated belief that having that sort of representation means that better decisions can get made for the benefit of a much broader majority than what we have to date, which has been built up over generations, where we now have a very narrow mold for what success and leadership looks like, and only a few voices get to determine for all the rest of us how we need to be and look and think and act in order to succeed.
Wow. Thank you, Dharshi. That's such an incredible journey. Coming from being an underrepresented group, but also acknowledging that you have that privilege. So now you're not just opening doors, but actually being a champion for people that are underrepresented. So in behalf of people who are underrepresented, I'd like to thank you. So Dharshi, on your podcast, Unbiased, you talk a lot about representation and bias in leadership. But first off, what does unbiased mean for you?
Yeah, great question. Yes, it's that you really hit on this, it's an amalgamation of a few things. When we're talking about being unbiased, it's really trying to limit the amount of biases, that is a certain propensity that we all have as individuals to make kind of snap judgments one way or another. So we all have biases. They are part of our cognitive makeup. They enable us to make those quick decisions. If we did not have the mental shortcuts that we take, and if we didn't have them, it would take us hours just to get out of bed in the morning, right? We are living in a world where we have so much information coming at us. We're juggling so many things that we need to find these mental shortcuts to make our days easier and with less friction. But particularly in the world of inclusion, where this comes about, is that sometimes some of those mental shortcuts we take can end up with an outcome that can be detrimental to our other people, our environment. And what happens is that the more that we all exercise them, and we exercise them in majority, then the more embedded they become into our culture, where we now don't even think of them as a bias. We actually think of them as a fact or a truth. And really the essence of unbiased is to invite us all to have conversations and to try and catch ourselves whenever we are making these decisions, and to ask ourselves, why do we think this way? Who told us this? Is this right? Is it not? And we may decide that, yep, this bias is working for us. But it's really about stopping to question these biases, because so often they are actually unconscious. And so the first step is to bring them into the fore. And so through the podcast, it started very much with this inclusion bent and having conversations with people whose voices we don't hear in mainstream media, people who are advocates for inclusion through having suffered from unwarranted biases themselves and how they address them. And I've more recently relaunched, and I suppose it's partly influenced by my coaching studies and really getting into the cognitive side of things, that I'm really looking as well to maybe to ourselves and what are the biases that we have that we need to question a little bit more in order to get rid of some of those limiting beliefs, in order to act in ways that are less harmful to ourselves, other people, and the environment around us, and really just continue this conversation because, as I said, it's really deep-seated over generations. It is part of our culture that we operate in. And actually talking about even discrimination and inclusion in the language of bias, I think can actually be a way to depersonalize it sometimes, where we're facing, leaders that might stand before us with a lot of privilege and be really cognizant of it, but actually then become a bit defensive about how they've got there. And it's to say, this is not because, you haven't got there because you've been a bad person or you've been personally discriminatory, but you have to understand that you have been existing in a culture which is particularly biased and favors certain people and circumstances over others. And so now, as a leader, it's your job to really address it and be part of a world that goes actually in a future that is pretty uncertain right now. And in corporate environments where we're always under so much pressure, maybe we need to start thinking about doing things a bit differently. Maybe we really need to let go of this vernacular of, oh, well, that's just the way it's always been done, because maybe the way it's always been done has been affected by a deep-seated bias that excludes swathes of people.
You already mentioned being part of an underrepresented group. So I'm curious if, just to paint a picture, have you personally faced moments of bias in your career and how did you navigate them?
Yes, this is, a question I get asked a lot. And as I said, it was really having many minor, I wouldn't say that I've had major instances that were just a sort of a deal breaker in my career that made me move into the work that I do. I'd say that it's what they can call sort of death by 1,000 paper cuts. I think for me personally, it was more that almost an internal gaslighting that happens because day by day, goalposts will move as you become more senior, and you may not have objective criteria for promotion. It's just a feel or a culture or a fit that you might not have. And when you question what that is, your leaders may not be able to articulate that. And so you're the one left thinking, oh, maybe I'm actually not as good as I thought I was, or maybe I'm not putting enough work in or as much effort in as I thought I was. And so I think there was a big mental drain that came from a few years of constantly finding these niggles hitting in. I think for me personally, becoming a parent changed things up a lot because I was working for a big law firm for a while, and they are objectively meritocratic, or your KPIs are based on hours that you can work. But if you have other responsibilities that may mean that you can't put in exactly the same number of hours, then you're naturally going to fall behind when it comes to, say, promotion, for example. And so sort of seeing these factors that will indirectly discriminate against people that, again, don't fit this very narrow mold of maybe someone who has, permanent support at home, doesn't have caring responsibilities for others, has all this support, that they can proceed more. But I am careful now with these examples largely because I think we're flooded with them, actually. We've had some great shifts through, for women, through Me Too movements. We're really, really bringing up a history, and I said this deep-seated culture that had been going on for generations when it comes to, sexual assault in the workplace, gender discrimination, ageism, this need again for a resistance to neurodiversity, because there's just one way to get to where you need to go. And I think we have made great shifts forward through people sharing their stories. And as a coach, I'm now privy to so much more of this data that on one hand can start to make people become desensitized to it. And sometimes I fall into a space of thinking, there are so many stories, there is so much data in this space, and yet it can feel like the needle doesn't move that or quickly, or maybe quickly enough for someone as impatient as me. So I suppose where some of my focus goes now in navigating it is trying to understand myself better and trying to understand other people better. So for me, self-awareness is really the key to navigating times and periods and circumstances where we find ourselves either being on the receiving end of unwarranted bias or exhibiting a particular bias and showing, a particular preference or favoritism to someone because, they look like us, for example. And that sort of drives a lot of my work around, authentic leadership. There's a lot of jargon in this space. And so it's really trying to break this down. And part of that is speaking other people's languages sometimes. It's trying to be as multilingual as we can with our behaviors and our interactions. So I can share with, an old white, senior leader who's been in his position for several years, and as empathetic as he might be, some of those stories just may not be resonating. And so for me, navigating bias is about listening to other people wherever they come from and trying to understand their motivations and then trying to find that commonality, because I have an underlying belief that we should give people the benefit of the doubt and that there is more that we have in common than that divides us. And I think it's this culture that has actually created more division than commonality.
Right. I'm glad you talked about the many stories or plenty of stories out there, because as much as we like to talk about the negative effects of social media, I think it really helped in bringing out people's stories. For example, as a man, the Me Too movement was such an eye-opener for me, knowing how women experience those things, and at the same time, like how I can be part of the problem and how I can hold that space for women. So in a way, it helped me. But you're right. At times we could be there's too much exposure as well. So we need to engage in more in discussions like this, where it's more of a dialogue and listening to each other. But you pointed out an interesting point about looking at our own personal biases as well and how it can be harmful to us. So what do you mean by that exactly? Do you have like examples of that?
Yeah, actually, I have. It's as someone I'm often happy to share them. Certainly, when in my work in the legal industry, I'm talking to other lawyers where we share a lot of common traits because as we've come through a similar style of training and often similar educational background. And I've had to acknowledge the fact that even though I have a podcast called Unbiased and I work in inclusion, that I have a lot of biases that I really have to continually work on. And so I think what I mean by that, I suppose one place to start is what you call a blind spot bias, where actually most people think that they're less biased than those around them. And as I said, I'm someone that can easily fall into that trap because I enter into a room and I have, I'm so well read on this stuff. I know this stuff, but as I said, these are shortcuts, and I am just like everyone else. I'm juggling many priorities. I have super filled busy days, and it's easy to slip into those times when I don't actually see them, or I think that maybe something I say has more credence because I must be coming from a less biased place than my counterpart. So for me, I also have what we can call an affinity bias. We are looking to belong, but it's really hard to sometimes articulate or capture the fact that belonging, or, in the corporate world, we talk a lot about this culture fit, can actually be code for people that look or think like us. And whilst I work to increase the breadth of representation at leadership, I know that when I go to a networking event where I know that there's not that many people that maybe look like me, if I find someone that's on my wavelength and maybe thinks things that are very similar to me, I'm very likely, as an introvert as well, that will beeline for one person rather than schmooze a room, I'm likely to connect with that and engage with that person much more freely and readily than really force myself to invite those other perspectives into my own daily life. So yes, I think that it's really important to start with ourselves, actually. And before I go to say, well, there is societal inequity, well, it's someone else, why I was robbed of that promotion. I think we can only control what we control, and that's what we learn through coaching, right? We really want people to use everything that is a part of our identity to propel ourselves forward, because that is the only thing, that is the lever that we do have. And so if we are from an underrepresented group, then we've got to use that, because right now we are we're being dealt the hand that we've been dealt. But what can we draw on? What are our strengths? What have we gained from it? For me, I have an incredibly strong work ethic. It's been, I'm a child of immigrants. I felt the need to always prove myself, and as a result, I have performed, and I can use that to my advantage. But I can also acknowledge that, there were reasons that I felt the need to keep performing. And as a coach, I look to hold space for those people who are facing that burnout, because whilst everyone in this world, it seems, is to some degree exhausted and suffering from burnout, I think that the more hurdles that you've had to overcome through your life, then the greater that exhaustion level is set to be. And if we can tend to ourselves first, then we can start to have a bit more space and energy for other people. We can start to have a bit more empathy for other people, because I'm now really a bit more self-aware and enough to know that before I jump to judge someone for cutting me in line, that I have biases too, that I have issues too, that sometimes come into play. And it's not because I'm a bad person, but maybe I've, had a tough conversation with my boss just half an hour ago, or I've had a screaming kid that I've had to drop off. That everyone has their story. And I think, first of all, looking to ourselves, understanding that our own self-motivations is as good a starting point as any.
Right. I'm glad you talked about burnout already, because I don't know if you have similar stories as mine, but I was just in Dubai a few months ago, and I visited Dubai, and then anytime I meet someone and they find out that I'm Filipino, they say, "Oh, Filipino, you're very hardworking. You're a very hardworking group." And then when I also pursued my master's in Europe, in Hungary and in France, I noticed that my Southeast Asian classmates tend to work harder than our European counterparts. So I don't know if you've experienced something similar, but when you're from an underrepresented group, there's a tendency to constantly prove yourself, or constantly try to exceed the expectations, or the job description, basically. So in that case, it can lead to burnout. So what advice can you give people to make sure that, okay, you have to prove yourself, but at the same time, you have to take care of your well-being?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a great driver behind the work that I do, because I have to acknowledge that, and as I say, now that my data pool continues to grow with the more people that I coach, I see this really common thread of people feeling that need to prove themselves. And there is such power in community in that regard. I think that the more and more people, and the more that through podcasts like yours, where we shine a light on the fact that, yes, both you and I as well are part of that crew that have constantly felt the need to prove themselves. I think that can help the awareness really start to sink in, that this is not because you're deficient in what you're doing, that you aren't good enough to be in the place that you're working towards, and it's endemic in our culture, because there isn't representation. Because if we had representation of, more people, say from Southeast Asia, when you're in that multinational company, that maybe wherever they're operating in, they'll still have the leaders that they've brought in from Western Europe or the US, for example. If you had more of that representation, one, you would know it's possible to get there, and that you don't. And if you have more than just that one token representative, but actually data shows that you need at least 3 people, say, on a board, say 3, whether it's women, whether it's, from whatever that group is, to actually feel like you both belong, and you can now actually almost like just exhale a bit and go, oh, okay, I don't have anything to prove anymore. The reason that you have that sense that you need to prove yourself is because you don't see any representation of yourself there. And it's so important to understand that and to really internalize it. So I think I speak to many, many people that do get it intellectually, that they shouldn't have to work so hard, or they know that they're just as competent, if not more competent than someone that maybe perceptively has gotten that promotion or gotten to where they want to go faster than you. But they would still think, oh, maybe if I just work a bit harder, and if I just do a little bit more. And my experience, both my own personal lived experience and from the work that I've been doing, is that is not the answer. The answer is to actually really know and believe that the only reason you feel you need to prove yourself is because of the culture in which you're operating in. And it's only really once you believe that you will then be able to slow down and find a more strategic way to meet your goals. Now, I suppose why I'm an evangelist about coaching is maybe I had the benefit of coaching at a point of time where I was suffering from burnout, and I had been operating on empty for so long that I didn't even know what it meant to be. I didn't really know what self-care was on a day-to-day basis, where you feel you can tackle the day and still have energy left at the end of it. And so I had that experience of someone understanding that you can't fit into someone else's mold. You have to use your own reserves, and you have to be who you are and play on your terms. Now, that's very hard if you don't have representation. So in the meantime, find other people who feel that same way and get the reassurance that you need, however that might be, and whether that is from a coach or whether it's from mentors, friends, your other community, where you can get validation to say, do you feel like you're working all the time for half the recognition? And know that you're not alone. I think community is really, really important here, because I've just seen that especially high achieving people, they know something intellectually, but unless it sits, you're not going to have the motivation to say, I'm actually going to work a few less hours and focus on myself, because you're just not sure that the benefit will come through. Once you try it, then you have to try it, and you have to trust the process and make it small, and make it for a small period of time. Say for 30 days, I'm going to try and get that 8 hours sleep, or whatever that thing is that you want to do more of. I'm going to dedicate an hour a day of unadulterated time with my kid, and I'm not going to check the email. Just say it's just for a short amount of time. You're not going to lose your job for just taking 1 hour out for a period. And it's an experiment. It's a constant experiment. It's constant iteration, and really measure. How did you feel? Did my work suffer? What was the feedback that I was getting? How was my relationship with my child? Or how was I feeling after those 8 hours sleep? It's data collection. Everything is data, and you need to keep testing and experimenting for yourself. And you need to, as adults, we need to take agency for that as well. And this is sort of a slight tangent, but related. But I'm someone that through my work, whether it was in inclusion, through overcoming my own experiences of burnout and fatigue, I have, read and researched and studied everything under the sun, whether it's from inclusion to productivity. And I've read all of these, there's all these generally guys, with millions of followers, and I am following them to a T. And at some point, as much as I take so many elements of all of them, and they're very much part of me today, I'm still very passionate about productivity and about efficiency. But so often I would kind of fall off the wagon after a few months because it didn't fit for me. And I felt like if I'm not doing it just like the book says to do it, then I'm doing it wrong. But you've got to remember that if you're a grown adult with plenty of lived and learned experience, you can trust yourself. And if it doesn't work for you, take what works for you and reject the rest, because everyone that wants to help, the first place we go to is our own experience. And if something's worked for us, we want to share it with the world. And I'm no different. I would love to share that with the world. But I also know that you have to do what works for you. And that's where that coaching piece comes in, because unlike mentors or leaders that say they're coaching people, but they're actually just telling you what to do this because it worked for me, that might not work for you. So where coaching comes in, or what the benefit of getting a coach is, that they say it's predicated on the fact that you have all the answers, you know what your goal is, you know how to get there. I'm just here to help you uncover that. And once you do that, you are actually going to unlock so many more reserves of energy, because you're now not expending a ton of energy trying to be someone you're not, please people that you don't even want to be when you grow up, so to speak, and constantly chasing something that you think you ought to be chasing because someone told you to chase it, because that's their metric for success. So it really comes down to finding what works for you. And there isn't a hack other than, as I said, trying and testing slowly, because it does take quite a lot of work in the first instance. And it does take quite a lot of energy in the first instance. And actually, for people that are used to working 24/7, it's incredibly difficult to slow down. Everyone thinks, oh yeah, just take a spa break, just take a rest, it's easy. It's really not. And I think you need to acknowledge that, but you also need to acknowledge that that is the work that you might need to do. And if you're too resistant to something, if something's scaring you, that's probably the thing that you need to be doing.
I love that perspective, Dharshi, of not fitting the mold for others. So, and it needs a lot of self-reflection and a lot of self-awareness. But for you to get to that self-awareness, you also need other people. So like what you said about having a community of people like you, or mentors. But I love what you said about agency and having a coach, because if you do everything on your own, if you do reflect on your own, it could work. But at the same time, you could just be retelling yourself the same story over and over again. And you need a coach to challenge those beliefs, to challenge those perspectives. You need self-awareness, but you need others for that self-awareness. So such an interesting perspective. Right. Now, let's talk about the other side of the coin, because you already mentioned about token representation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you promote diversity and inclusion, there tends to be pushback, especially for some leaders who are probably juggling with a lot of tasks already. And this seems like an additional burden. Say you're a recruiter and you already found a perfect candidate or the right candidate, but because of company policies or country laws, now you have to look for others just for that inclusion and diversity, that token representation. So what do you say to that?
Yes. What do you say to that? I'm someone that goes through swathes of time where I can be incredibly frustrated with corporate diversity and inclusion, because it is so policy and process driven. As much as I'm really moved by data, sometimes in this space, there's a sense that, well, if you can't measure it and have something on a pie chart, then it doesn't count or it's not valuable. But this is where I suppose I would go to coaching principles. A big tenet, as you will know, Ken, is reframing. And so as soon as someone says it's too hard, we've got too much on our plates, we can't now add to this, putting in another policy and having to just hire this person just because this is a gap in our current DEI data metrics. And now it's going to be not only tokenistic, but now even the people getting hired into those roles feel like, I don't want to be a quota, or I don't want to be a diversity hire. And I say, rather than framing this as a burden, can we actually start to think of it as the solution that we're looking for future-proofing our organizations? I mentioned earlier, you know, I really hate this constant tie to the status quo, and this is how it's always been done and it's always worked. And yet today we are facing a period of so much uncertainty, so much polarization. We have technology sort of driving us rather than the other way around. And when I speak to leaders and the senior leaders that I coach who want to find a way forward, but are also very much have this rhetoric of Dharshi, this DEI stuff. I'm, you know, can't just people just be a good person, and why do I need to care about this stuff as it is? It's too prosaic. I just want to go out and do what I need to do. And I say, one, that's great. It would be ideal if everyone was, but to a lot of what we've spoken about before, we're operating in a very biased framework in the first place. And secondly, my solution to this problem of, you know, this generational divide, or, you know, the new people coming in have very different values to the old leaders, and I don't know how to talk to them. We're struggling to retain talent and recruit the most talented people. My suggestion as a solution is, how about thinking about broadening the net? How about thinking about that representation, meaning that you can have less friction in meetings because you're not starting to get this slightly polarized discussions happening? How about we think about those values and identifying them so that you have a clear North Star, and you don't have to think, oh, this is a bit tricky because this person has all these great qualities, but they have this big red flag. Well, maybe actually you should think about embedding those values, because then that's your North Star. And unless it's 100% yes, it's a no, and we move on and we don't have decision fatigue. And all of those are using inclusion-driven principles. How about taking the number one tenet of coaching, listening? How about actually, if we spent 10 minutes of that 20-minute meeting listening, you could probably come up with the solution much quicker than spending that whole time just thinking, no, I've got my agenda, I have to do this. How about where we have technology that we are feeling very mixed about because it holds a lot of answers, particularly in knowledge work, like the industries that I work in and amongst. But we're quite scared of it, because what does it mean for us as, you know, lawyers if we can't charge out, or many businesses and creative industries included stand to be disrupted? But what if we're working, and I work with leaders who are working 12, 14, 16 hour days, and they're still having so much struggle and they're still having so much burnout. So how about we divvy up those 16 hours? I'm not asking you to put 2 more hours into your day for inclusion. I'm saying let's prioritize and take 2 hours out to put to inclusion. And again, we test it and we iterate it, and we see if in a month's time, do you have a bit more engagement? Are you getting less speak out during meetings? Test it out and see. So it's saying prioritize it for a small period and trust the process. And actually, it could be the solution to your problem. It can lighten your load. And then once people start seeing the benefit to anything, then the motivation comes, right? Then we're minded to keep doing this. Oh, we can keep doing the same. And I can still get out and go and see my kids play or what have you. Mm-hmm. And you know, my stakeholders or my clients are no less better off. But we're humans and we hate change. And it is again, a hard one, but it's constant reframing. And that's how we adapt to change. And we're going to have to keep doing that. So why are we making things hard on ourselves by constantly telling ourselves that stuff is hard and difficult and tiring? Why can't we say that it's challenging and exciting and keeping things interesting and helping to lighten my load?
Right. It's about trusting the process and looking at the benefits rather than the burden of having inclusion and diversity in your company. So Dharshi already talked about this a little bit, but I guess I just wanted to focus on how do you ensure that what you're doing is really authentic, that you're really doing DEI authentically and not just doing something because it's a policy, or not just doing because I need to do it.
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because, as I said, there's a lot of jargon, and sometimes authenticity and bringing your best self to work or your whole self to work can have mixed meanings for different people. But one really important point is that authenticity isn't just one thing. It's under that self-awareness that we come back to. It's both understanding yourself and how you are in relation to others. We all, operate within relationships with others. To your point, we can't do things alone, and we can try, but it will take us a whole lot longer, and be more likely to cause us burnout. And so the point when it comes to continuing to act authentically is to really be so grounded in what your values are that you're then able to apply them in any situation. So this is where, as you hear this language of I have to sell my soul for this employer, or, oh, I have to be someone I'm not just to get ahead. I don't necessarily see your being both sort of authentic and operating in a sustainable way as mutually exclusive with playing the corporate game, for example. It's just saying that the way in which you will approach a situation is true to yourself. So you might be, for example, a leader who hates conflict, but that in most of our day jobs, we have to be able to navigate that. So again, how do you reframe that to just be a problem-solving situation, or what is the problem to be solved? Who do I need to help me solve it? And then we approach it in a different way, rather than, oh, well, we have grown up in a culture where we're just at each other's throats when it comes to leadership. We have to make big decisions and hire and fire, etc. You can still succeed on that in a way that your role requires you to, but in a way that's authentic to yourself. What's another example? If you're someone for whom humility is a really strong value, and you don't want to have to be blowing your own trumpet all the time, well, but you work in an organization where you have to be able to, if you want to secure your budgets, if you want to secure your own promotions, then you have to be able to share your wins. Well, how do you articulate them in a way that stays true to yourself? Maybe that's when you talk about your team success. You're calling out other people and making it less about you, but you're still showing that success. And so the constant journey is to ask yourself in every situation, like, how do I do this in a way? Because I know I have to do this right now. Sometimes we all have to do things we don't want to do sometimes, or we all have to keep an eye on the bigger picture. I have been fortunate enough, if I have found myself in workplaces that I no longer wanted to be in, I had the option to quit or to change up. Not everyone has that option. For some of us, we have to be able to keep our job and keep moving forward. But that doesn't mean that that's it. You're selling your soul for the rest of your career, unless you want it to. If you want to find a sustainable way, you can. But once you have that true north, you then just got to think, right, how do I make the situation work in a way that I get to what I need to, or I get something out of this person by staying true to myself. And the important thing there as well is that only you know how to do this. This is where, again, you just want to be really careful when people say, just do this, just do the other. If it doesn't feel right, if it feels inauthentic, then you need to take a little bit more time to think through a way that you can do it while maintaining your authenticity.
So it's about going back to the values rather than the tasks. And in the previous episode, I talked with Stephen about being and doing. So in this case, it's about being inclusive instead of doing inclusivity, right?
Spot on, yeah.
Dharshi, in this podcast, we always talk about well-being. So you already talked a lot about burnout. So I'm just really curious, since you have such a unique background, you were in corporate law. So just to pursue law must have been tasking, and then to do it as a career. So when you look back at your own journey, what's one thing you wish you knew earlier about balancing personal well-being with a demanding career?
Yeah, I think it was really that the two aren't mutually exclusive. I did things the hard way, and I probably lived, as again, a lot of people, particularly I think people from immigrant backgrounds that may have been brought up in households where your parents also had to navigate a new space, and you're kind of taught to stay under the radar and just work really, really hard. Sometimes I certainly have a tendency to link achievement with something being really hard and taking all my energy. Sometimes it can feel like it's not worth as much if you haven't felt exhausted at the end of it. And so the biggest learning for me in actually getting to that rock bottom and having to build back up again is that you can work better and not harder if you look after your well-being. And again, I think you need to find what works for you. Again, I would subscribe to, oh, I'm going to this spa retreat, or I'm trying all these things, because you think about well-being as we see it in social media, but in the day-to-day lives, you might not have a week to chill out in a spa resort, or take vast chunks of time out, and you have to navigate being sustainable in short blocks of time. And I just wasn't really equipped to know where to start with that, because I fitted into that category, and still maybe struggle with it a bit, to slow down and to know that there's a value in rest, and that there's value in having a bit of headspace rather than constantly operating almost like a headless chicken. So I wish I knew back then the value of looking after your well-being. And I think it's only been through all these years of experience, and probably after getting to a senior enough level at work where you could call a few more of those shots, that you see how much more possible it is than you think to navigate your career on your own terms. And I think many industries are continuing to adapt, either to stay ahead of the curve or because they're being forced to. But now there are so many ways to do our work. I think the pandemic really supported remote working, for example, that had huge impact on on the disabled workforce, those who have caring responsibilities that might need to be in several places at once. I was slowly able to keep on reaping the benefit of those things and still managing to do the work. When you're constantly talking about working less hours, unfortunately, the reality is that we're still expected to produce. So we need to now find what is the most efficient way of producing. What is the way that we can get most bang for buck? And actually, sometimes it is taking more time out to rest and then operating at a full 100% than operating at 50% for years and years and years without even realizing it.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people can relate. That's right. There's a belief or a tendency to think that if we're exhausted, then we've done our part. But you're right about going to efficiency. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate about being told to go under the radar, because I've had several clients already who told me they felt that they were diversity hires. And so they will work hard but go under the radar. So it takes a lot of dealing with that imposter syndrome. So we've had to deal with that and letting them know that they deserve that space and they don't have to prove anything to anyone else but to themselves. So speaking of coaching, Dharshi, so how can people contact or check you out?
Thanks, Ken. Yes, LinkedIn is probably one of the easiest ways to find me, on Dharshi Harindra, or if you want to leave inquiries directly through my website, 𝗀𝗏𝗄𝗏.com, and I'm Dharshi Data Diversity on Instagram. An Unbiased Podcast is available on Spotify, and there'll be links throughout my social media profiles. But as you know, I could talk about these topics all day long. And if I am to see that change in representation, then I need to help out as many as I can. And so I really, there's sort of two prongs really to people that I coach, and they are those who are getting to that leadership, really want that leadership position, particularly in law at the moment, but are underrepresented in that leadership. So might be struggling with how we put that all together. But also those senior leaders, those partners that know that they need to affect change, but that don't have that support. I think that adage that it's lonely at the top really stands quite true. So I tend to regularly post content on LinkedIn, and if any of that resonates, that's the easiest way for people to get hold of me.
Right. Thank you so much, Dharshi, for being a champion for DEI and helping underrepresented groups level up without burning out. And to everyone listening or viewing this podcast, Darshi's links and socials will be in the description of this podcast. And so, Darshi, thank you so much for doing this podcast with me. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Ken. I would love to tell every one of you watching that you have all the answers.
You have all the answers indeed. Thank you so much, guys. And please stay tuned and continue to watch Level Up. Don't burn out.